educate people, which is very interesting because Maureen is primarily studying what we call primary research reports, and she spends a lot of time digging those archives and looking for original documents. So she's using what we call textual analysis approach, and in particular rhetorical criticism, to look at not only the messages themselves, but also the persuasion power of those messages. And in particular, this case is interesting because it overlaps with issues of public diplomacy in early Brezhnev relations, Nixon-Brezhnev relations. So, Maureen?
Thank you. I'm Maureen Minielli from Study University of New York. The title of my presentation is A Rhetorical Analysis of Richard M. Nixon's Radio and Television Address to the People of the Soviet Union from May 28, 1972. I divide my paper in 4 different areas because the way we approach the study of rhetorical artifacts in our discipline is slightly different from how others do it, particularly people who have been here at the convention. So my paper first takes a look at the differences in academic departments who study the broader notion or the broader idea of what is communication. And then I take a look at the difference, the American difference between the study of communication and communications, which is a very particular issue among scholars who do study communication. And then I'll explain a little bit about rhetorical analysis, what that is about, and then we'll take a look at Nixon's speech and my argument that we need to use more primary documents when we are looking at rhetorical artifacts or speeches from the past. So one of the reasons I'm here is because I study rhetoric and I study political speeches, but I've always wanted to know what my Russian colleagues, what research they have done in terms of historical analysis or analysis of particular Soviet leader speeches, Putin, or in my case, Leonid Brezhnev. And what we discovered was that in the United States, we have dedicated communication departments where we house all of us who are here today. We would be usually in one department. Whereas our Russian colleagues, they also study the same artifacts that we do, but they come from different disciplines: political science, linguistics, philology, sociology. And so it's hard for us to connect with them and vice versa because we're not always attending the same conferences or engaging in the same ways. So when we look at the difference between communication and communications, you can see that in the humanities, we're studying rhetoric, persuasion, slightly political communication, which is my area. And then we have the social sciences like interpersonal communication, intercultural, public relations, which is what Sergei studies. And then we have communications, plural S, in the US that is traditionally reserved for television, film, and media. And I think we can probably make the argument where there is some overlap in areas. For example, political communication can be studied from both the theoretical, rhetorical side as well as the social science side. You see social media, which is Marta is doing. She could look at the word choices in those posts, or she could do the statistical analyses that she did to take a look at the user responses. And then also we have business communication, which stratifies both, which is what Rod was talking about a little bit with his paper on communication strategies. But then we also have separate departments. For example, journalism is in its own separate department, and typically you'll see public relations there, unlike in Russia where you have separate departments of public relations. And then if I were to look for anybody from the philology field, I would actually most likely have to go to the traditional Department of Classics, and you would typically find those at Ivy universities like Harvard, Yale, or we have separate departments in linguistics. So part of the reason I'm here is a very selfish reason, is because I want to learn how my Russian colleagues study the same rhetorical speeches or orations or communication as I do, but how they come from it from a different perspective. So what does it mean to do rhetorical analysis? It traditionally means 2 different aspects. You look at rhetorical theory, and this would be our methodology that we would apply to a particular speech. And when I say speech, I'm more traditional. I look at the actual presidential speech. There are many things that you can analyze. Poetry, memorials, you can look at political statements. it's much broader than how I'm portraying it, but since my approach, my research area is traditional, that would be the presidential speech, I'm focusing more on that. So we identify different theories that we can interpret a rhetorical speech, and then we do some rhetorical criticism. And first I want to address what is it meant by rhetorical analysis. Traditional rhetorical theory means that we identify different methods of interpreting a particular speech. So for example, Neo-Aristotelian is typically an approach that was really big in our discipline in the 1940s, 1950s, and has now matured and slightly disappeared in the sense that it's not predominantly used as a method to give presentations and publications, but it's used as an introductory means for graduate students or upper-level undergraduate students to start working and learning the process of rhetorical analysis. So Neo-Aristotelian criticism is basically applying Aristotle's 3 proofs of persuasion. That would be ethos, credibility of the speaker, logos, logic of the argument, and pathos, emotional appeals in the audience. And if I were to look at Nixon's speech from a Neo-Aristotelian perspective, I would clearly look at pathos because his speech was a ceremonial speech, more of praise and indicating unity and trying to draw the American and Soviet citizens together, as opposed to logos, which would be more of a political speech. We have the works of Kenneth Burke, who is a literary criticism individual. He's a critic. He has several theories. In fact, his works are so profound that there is a society named after him, Kenneth Burke Society, that studies solely Kenneth Burke. So he devised a way of examining communication through the pentad, and it's based on the notion life is a drama, we are acting out our roles in the life, kind of like a little theater introduction here, or influence. And so you have the act, you have the agency, the actor, the purpose, and the scene. And if I were to look at Nixon's speech in terms of the pentad, I would focus on the scene because of how important the summit meeting was and the speech that he gave at the Moscow summit, the significance of it, because he was the first American president to visit a Soviet leader in Moscow. He also, Kenneth Burke also does theories about identification, and it goes with, it explains how do people understand what an orator is saying, and how do we come together, how do we identify with each other. So I could also look at, in Nixon's speech, I could look at the similarities that he points out between the American people and the Soviet people to try to show that each nation's constituents were not as far apart as originally perceived. We have a narrative paradigm, which is more focused on storytelling, and that is a very compelling way to impart information. And if I were to look at Nixon's speech, I would take a look at Tanya, and I don't know her last name, but prior to Nixon's speech, he went up to Leningrad, and he saw the memorial for the Great Patriotic War, World War II, and I believe there's a memorial for the young girl, Tanya, who lost her family members one by one during the war until she was the last one alive, and then she eventually passed away as well. Well, Nixon was so touched by this story that he included it as the conclusion to his paper, or to his speech. And he used it, he was touched by it so much that he continually referred to this Tanya story in other political speeches in Moscow as well as back in the United States. And it's something that's very unusual for an American political speech to have some type of story. But there was a rationale for that, and we'll get to that later. We could take a look at the metaphors, and Nixon clearly used metaphors in his speech. He was actually given a lot of advice about how to speak to the Soviet people. He was told to tell stories, to speak in metaphors, to speak about parables. So he gives this little story about the length of stride, and an individual says, "How far is it to Moscow?" And the person says, "Well, how fast do you walk?" or something along those lines. And I guess the guy walks, and then he comes back, and he said, "Well, you didn't tell me it was this long." And the original person said, Well, you didn't tell me the length of your stride, you know, how long it would take to get there, because everyone has different ways of getting to the same final point. And Nixon used that to translate how the Soviets and the Americans were working towards mutual topics of interest, how they were working on the environment and health and space, and that even though our strides had been a little bit different than the other, we would eventually get to the same final point. And then what I'm doing for this particular analysis, for this paper, is employing what's known as textual analysis. It could be also known as content analysis, depending on how you look at it, and it's based on archival research. What does rhetorical criticism do? In the traditional sense, we look at political orations. These would be speeches that presidents give, or leaders give on a regular basis to their people, to the United Nations, to other citizens. We look at ceremonial speeches, for example, commencement addresses, when the president goes and congratulates individuals at a certain university. Or we take a look at other public communication, for example, statements made in press conferences. So for me to do what I do, I have to know a little bit about what everyone else here does. I have to know rhetoric, I have to know a little political science, history. I definitely have to know media studies, I have to know framing, I have to know spiral of silence. I definitely have to know philosophy and understand different philosophical individuals based on the subject that I'm looking at. Argumentation, how arguments are set up, or how presidents use fallacious arguments or invalid arguments to make a point. I have to know logic, and then I have to know a little bit of sociology and psychology. So anybody who studies rhetoric is pretty much a jack of all trades. We have to know a little bit of everything. But what you do notice that is not on the list is linguistics, philology, semiotics, semantics. If I had one course in graduate school that barely touched the surface of those subjects, and I think that is the major problem with uniting American scholars with Russian scholars who are studying political speeches. And that's part of the reason why we're here, to start building these bridges and to make these connections. So we'll take a look at Nixon's address. It was on Sunday evening, May 28th, 1972. It was broadcast live to the Soviet people on television and radio, and simultaneously broadcasted back to the United States via satellite. My main argument for my paper is that rhetorical scholars can generate better subjective interpretations of political addresses by drawing from primary documents and relying less on secondary documents. And the problem with our field is that anyone can come up and say, well, this is your opinion, this is your subjective interpretation, as opposed to what Marta does. She codes her data and she does a statistical analysis and generates all these numbers and has like a plus minus margin of error. And the sciences, the social sciences in America are perceived to be more legitimate, more valid, more scholarly, more worthwhile. They receive a lot more funding. And it's us traditionalists who come from the fields of English, philosophy, history, and communication. We are considered to be not as scholarly, or our results are not considered to be as legitimate, because we are making subjective interpretations based on the materials that we have read that inform us about a particular speech. And I've noticed here that there is a lot of subjectivity, it's a lot of people's opinions, but they're not backing up those positions. They're not providing evidence or statistics or examples from either the original thing that they're studying or from other areas. And we need to find a way to make our subjective interpretations more objective. So my argument is that we need to rely on primary documents, and what you're going to see in the next couple of slides are documents that I've researched from the Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. These are documents that were written in the moment in 1972, and I think that provides us a more objective way of taking a look at how the speech was created, what were the strategies, as opposed to reading a memoir that was written 10 years later that may be based on faulty memory or more grandiose ideas about a particular moment in time. So I just need to tell you a little bit about Nixon wordsmithing, or how speeches were created. Typically in the Nixon White House, multiple drafts were created, and then depending on the subject, either a single speechwriter would be assigned, or he would have multiple speechwriters working on the same topic, or on occasion, he would have multiple sets of speechwriters working on the same speech topic, and then he would look at all 3 or 4 versions and then take the best from the best and then start there to create his own final speech. Anytime you see a major public address from a president, if it's referencing Department of Defense, Department of State, Education, Commerce, they will have somebody from that department review that particular section to make sure there are no contradictions, to make sure that they are speaking validly about something, because once a president says something, he's got to own those words. People hold him to what is being said, so he's got to verify to make sure that everything is accurate. And this is a very long process. It doesn't happen in a couple of days. It usually starts happening 2 to 3 months ahead of time. And then Nixon makes the final decision. So this is a copy of the 3rd draft of the 1st page of Nixon's speech. It was written by his speechwriter Raymond Price, and it includes comments from Henry Kissinger. And what's interesting about this this page is this line right here, and it occurs right about here. This is the beginning of the speech. The line says, "I deeply appreciate this opportunity your government has given to me to speak directly with the Soviet people, with the people of the Soviet Union, to talk with you about the meetings we've had," that's what I'm looking at right here, "and to share with you some of my thoughts about the relations between our 2 countries and about the way to peace and progress in the world." Well, in the final speech that Nixon gave to the people, the line about "talk to you about the meetings" was changed to "bring you a message of friendship from all of the people of the United States." So what does this tell us? And this is why I think we need to have more primary documents. You would not know that originally his speechwriters had penned a political speech focusing on logos or ethos, but in the end changed it to a ceremonial speech to fit the event, it being a nationally televised address by a foreign leader, and it was more focused on pathos or arousing emotions in the audience, in this case, building bridges between the American and Soviet citizens. A gentleman by the name of A. Dennis Clift, he's a National Security Council member, and he is actually still alive. He is 88 years old. He developed this document, and I'll show you it in a second, indicating his ideas of themes for the summit public statements of the president. So he started in mid-April, and he said, now's the time to start thinking about what the president is going to say in the presidential, in his different speeches, the toast at the banquet, arrival remarks, the party remarks, and so on. And he said that it might be a good thing for Nixon to reference his 1959 Soviet address when he did address the Soviet people, but as Vice President of the United States. He suggested that the speech have a positive tone, and of course he suggested that Nixon address global peace. And what we actually see in this document right here, you'll see that this document's about 8 pages long. And these are all different ideas that Clift had announced or had suggested to Ray Price, the speechwriter. And then Ray Price would take some of these ideas, run it past Nixon. Nixon would come back and say, no, I want to do this, this, and this. Ray Price would say back to him, we could do this, this, and this. There would be negotiation. But in the end, Nixon would have the final say. And a lot of documents, you will see Nixon's own handwriting saying, change this, move this, change this word. This line right here talks about how we can measure the success or failure of a speech. It's addressing audiences. And Cliff had said, we can begin to enunciate the point we need to focus on the important foreign audiences, the Soviet Union, the United States allies, China, Eastern Europe, and the third world countries. And a rhetorical scholar knows that when someone gives a speech, it's not just to one audience, there is always multiple audiences. And for here, I would also include not just the allies, but the foes, or the individuals who are against the United States. So how do we measure a speech success? And this is where we try to bring in the the quantitative data. We take a look at reactions from audiences. You'll typically see Harris polls or some type of poll after the speech indicating that they liked the speech, they didn't like it. You will have the media's accounts. For example, the New York Times said that Nixon's speech to the people was mildly successful, all right? But then you have to understand the history between Nixon and the New York Times, and you have to know that they hated each other. So for even the Times to give like some sort of faint praise is like, you know, a miracle. We take a look at presidential polls after speeches. If the numbers go up, the people like the speech. If the numbers go down, they did not like it. And then typically back in Nixon's time, they would measure the success from the number of letters or telegrams that they had received. Except with Nixon, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because Nixon would have his aides call people and ask them to send in telegrams or letters praising his efforts. And so it was, when he would come up and say, we've received 11,000 positive responses, well, you can guarantee 3/4 of them were artificially generated from the Republican National Committee as such. So should we look at primary documents? They help reveal themes, goals, or the intentions of speeches, the choices that people had, the speechwriters, the president, the decisions that were made and why. And it does also tell us about the conflicts, because individuals within the White House are arguing. I remember I forget what speech it was one word, and they spent 3 weeks arguing over how to describe something, one word. And Nixon said, screw this, we're just calling it this and that's it. All right, and everyone shut up. So it describes the conflicts and then also gives the perspectives from the different stakeholders, individuals, particularly the president, what his goal was, what he wanted to do, how did he see things. So if we use primary documents, I think that we can create more effective interpretations. They would be considered less subjective because they're created in the moment. The documents that are available, that are uncensored, but when you do research in the Nixon library or any presidential library, you often encounter a lot of documents that have been sanitized or censored due to national security reasons or whatever reason. Even though this speech occurred over 40 years ago in 1972, if you're interested, I can show you the documents where the page is there and it's just all black, it's a sanitized. And you go to the next one, it's all black, there's nothing there. You go to the next one, everything is blanked out except for one line. So it makes research, it makes it a little bit difficult, it's very time consuming, but I think it is worthwhile. It provides a context for the speech so we understand internally what was going on. It explains the constraints on the speechwriters, the president, the United States, and also reveals various types of attitudes. And so this is my fun document because I've noticed that a lot of my Russian colleagues like to see fun things from the Nixon archives. So it's a little hard to see, but this is the advice his speechwriter, Bill Sapphire, gave Nixon about 11 days before the address. So the first line says, refer to Russian peoples in the plurals. You don't say singular, you always say plural. Then he says, Mir et druzhba, peace and friendship, is now a cliche that smacks of woolly-headedness in the USSR. I have suggested that the toast to be to a peaceful future, which also finesses the line as he was toasting the Kremlin leaders. And then what I thought you might enjoy right here, the name of the mayor of Moscow is Promislov, which in America would make a great name for a politician. The notion of being promised. So, in conclusion, we just gave you a brief idea about the academic departments, where communication is situated, and how we are in different departments, but we also have overlap. And then talked about the difference between communications, gave you a great idea, a quick primer about rhetorical analysis, and then hopefully convinced all of you that if you do this type of study, perhaps you will consider using primary documents to help create better informed interpretation.